At the beginning of 2025, the United States unleashed what many economists described as the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike against Venezuela's oil sector. The move went far beyond simply cutting off American purchases. Washington first shut down Chevron's authorization to operate in Venezuela, effectively ending the last significant U.S.-controlled oil production there. Output that had been exceeding 100,000 barrels a day. But the decisive blow arrived on April 2, 2025, when the U.S. introduced an unprecedented system of secondary tariffs. The message to the rest of the world was blunt. If any country purchased even a token amount of Venezuelan crude, the U.S. would slap a 25% tariff on all of that nation's exports headed to American markets. This applied not just to oil, but to everything. Consumer electronics, household goods, furniture, you name it. Considering typical U.S. tariffs sit near 2%, this sudden jump to 25% would render any country's products instantly uncompetitive. The design of the policy was mathematical. Make the global cost of purchasing Venezuelan oil so devastating that it eliminates their exports entirely. It was one of the most forceful displays of U.S. economic influence in the hemisphere in decades. The logic behind it was straightforward. No nation would jeopardize access to the world's largest consumer market just to maintain trade ties with Venezuela. But that calculation overlooked the one power that didn't have to worry about such consequences: China. By 2025, Beijing and Washington were already deeply entrenched in a chronic trade conflict, with Chinese goods facing multiple waves of tariffs long before this new threat. A fresh 25% penalty simply blended into the background of their ongoing dispute. Instead of being deterred, China found itself almost immune to the pressure and, more significantly, in a position to seize an opportunity. As countries across Asia, Europe, and beyond backed away in fear of American retaliation, Venezuelan crude suddenly lay wide open for China to negotiate over. From a position of overwhelming leverage, China wasn't stepping in as one buyer among many. It was becoming the only buyer. In effect, the U.S. sanctions created a market where a single dominant customer held all bargaining power, and China embraced that role with ease. With competitors pushed aside, Beijing didn't quietly increase its imports. It made a massive strategic declaration. In September 2025, while global headlines focused on the tariff fallout, a Chinese firm, China Conquered, began installing the first major new offshore oil platform in Venezuela's Lake Maracaibo in many years. This was a billion-dollar long-term venture, designed to boost output from roughly 12,000 barrels per day to an estimated 60,000 barrels per day by 2026. While Washington attempted to suffocate Venezuela's oil industry, China was injecting enormous capital to revive and expand it, on terms that ensured Chinese influence would be deeply rooted. The signal was unmistakable. China was not treating Venezuela as a temporary convenience, but as a long-term cornerstone of its energy strategy. This dramatic step in 2025 wasn't an isolated reaction. It was the culmination of years of carefully built partnership. In 2023, Venezuela became the first nation in Latin America to secure what China labels an all-weather strategic partnership, Beijing's highest category of alliance. This status is reserved for relationships China commits to regardless of shifting global conditions, a pledge of political loyalty and economic backing. So when Washington launched its tariff offensive, it confronted not a fragile alignment, but a heavily reinforced one. China had already decided it would stand firmly behind Caracas, making the U.S. pressure campaign far less effective than intended. Yet the deepest tie between the two countries is financial. Over time, China has extended about $60 billion in loans to Venezuela, structured in a way that repayment must come through oil deliveries rather than cash transfers. It's essentially a closed system. Venezuela owes oil, and China is entitled to receive it. These shipments are not discretionary purchases that sanctions can intimidate. They're the fulfillment of binding agreements. The United States cannot stop this flow without demanding that Venezuela violate an international financial obligation. This immense debt ensures that China will continue receiving Venezuelan crude regardless of the geopolitical climate. Meanwhile, the U.S. faced a troubling consequence of its own strategy. Refineries along the Gulf Coast, especially in Texas and Louisiana, were engineered over decades to handle heavy, dense crude oil. And one of the most important sources of that exact type of petroleum was Venezuela. In trying to cripple Venezuela, the U.S. inadvertently disrupted supply chains that its own refining infrastructure depended on, all while China secured a long-term grip on a vital energy resource. Modern refineries that handle heavy crude aren't designed to flip to another oil type overnight. It's the industrial equivalent of forcing a diesel truck to run on gasoline. It simply doesn't work without major changes. When the sanctions hit, U.S. refineries were thrown into chaos. They had to scramble for replacements, paying inflated prices for heavy oil from places like Canada and the Middle East, and absorbing huge costs to adjust their systems. The policy didn't only squeeze Venezuela. It also saddled American companies with enormous financial setbacks, revealing a critical oversight in Washington's strategy. And after all that, what was achieved? The numbers from October 2025 tell a surprising story. Venezuela's total exports did fall by about a quarter, but the main objective of the sanctions never materialized. Rather than collapsing, Venezuela simply redirected almost all of its oil to one buyer, China. The scale of the shift was staggering. China began importing roughly 663,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil every day, amounting to 80% of Venezuela's global sales. Meanwhile, U.S. imports dwindled to only 128,000 barrels a day. This wasn't just a market adjustment. It was China gaining overwhelming control over a supply chain the U.S. once dominated. Far from isolating Venezuela, the sanctions effectively handed its oil industry to America's primary competitor. China didn't stop at energy. In November 2025, it introduced another major move: a zero-tariff agreement with Venezuela covering around 400 product categories, from crops to manufactured goods. This transformed the partnership from a basic energy trade into a deeply integrated economic relationship. Venezuela became embedded in China's supply network, serving both as a source of raw materials and a market for Chinese products. This tariff-free pact cemented the long-term alignment of the two nations, creating an economic bond far stronger and more durable than a simple oil-for-payment arrangement. When viewed as a whole, the outcome reflects one of the most significant strategic missteps by the United States in recent years. Washington relied on its traditional tool, financial isolation, believing it could force political change by cutting off revenue. But this approach assumed a world where U.S. economic dominance was uncontested. Today, that's no longer the reality. China has spent decades constructing alternative financial systems, trade networks, and diplomatic relationships that operate independently of American influence. So when sanctions landed, Venezuela didn't fall apart. It shifted decisively into China's economic sphere. Instead of weakening China, the U.S. unintentionally delivered it a geopolitical triumph: access to valuable energy resources and a stronger foothold in the Western Hemisphere at minimal cost. The episode exposed the limitations of America's leverage and highlighted the risks of relying on old strategic playbooks in a changing world. This shift represents more than the redirection of oil shipments. It signals the fading of the unipolar era, a time dominated by a single superpower, and the rise of a multipolar world where influence is shared among several major players. Venezuela's case exemplifies this transformation. Under intense pressure, it survived by turning to a new power center that could match, and sometimes exceed, the capabilities of the United States. The geopolitical landscape of the Americas has been fundamentally reshaped. China is no longer just another trading partner. It is now an investor in key infrastructure, a shield in diplomatic conflicts, and a strategic backer for nations seeking alternatives to U.S. influence. This alters the calculus for every U.S. policy decision in the region, because Beijing's reaction must now be factored in. The rules of global power have changed. The Venezuelan episode shows how, in this century, coercive strategies carry enormous risks. The biggest consequence of a policy may not be its intended effect, but the unexpected strengthening of a rival. We have entered a complex strategic era, where every action sends out waves that can reshape the geopolitical landscape far beyond the original target.